I lost it on my child again. I'm damaging them. My child is struggling. I must not be doing enough. We can't go anywhere. We don't fit in. Something must be fundamentally wrong with us. If you've said any of those things to yourself or felt them in your body, even when you couldn't find the words, this episode is for you. These are the three most common things I hear from parents of PDA, autistic, ADHD, or high needs kids. And what they all have in common is this: they are shame spirals. Okay. And this shame, it doesn't just hurt, it keeps your nervous system stuck. It builds a stress load in your body instead of letting you regulate and recover, which means the very thing you most want to show up better for your child becomes harder and harder the longer you stay stuck in shame. So today I'm going to show you what's actually driving these loops, okay? What's underneath them and how to start breaking free so that you can be the regulated parent that you want to be for your child. Not when life gets easier, now. Okay, so a few years ago, we were in the thick of my son's burnout. Okay, he was in a phase of breaking glass whenever he got activated. Okay, so I could handle a lot of his outbursts, right? Like the hitting, the throwing, the spitting. But the glass breaking wore on me in a way that I can't fully explain. Okay, the sound of it, the danger of it, the exhaustion of cleaning it up while he was raging, trying to keep him safe while also defending myself. Okay, and one morning he woke up really agitated. Okay, and he interrupted my morning regulation routine, which is the one thing back then that was holding me together in those years. Okay, and he could sense my agitation. Okay, he ran downstairs, he took a glass from the cupboard and he threw it on the floor. And the sound just jolted my whole body. I ran down and just stood there for a moment, frozen. I watched him start to step toward the broken glass, and then I screamed at him to step back. And then I started furiously cleaning it up with all this rage on my face that I wasn't even trying to hide. Okay. I was so upset. And then he ran to grab a glass vitamin bottle, like one of those dropper bottles with liquid in it. And it was expensive. Okay. And he held it, and he had broken it many times before. Okay. And he held it up and he threatened to smash it against the glass dining table. Okay. So glass on glass. So everything I had been holding down came exploding out of me. And then I ran towards him like an animal, right? Unleashed animal. And he bolted. And then I reached him and I grabbed his hand, the one that was holding the glass bottle. And I said through gritted teeth, "Don't you dare ever break my vitamin bottles." And he froze and he started to cry. And in that moment, I came out of the trance I was in. I let go. I went back to the glass on the floor and cleaned it up. And I sat in my pile of shame. Okay, my inner critic was screaming inside, "You're damaging him. You will never change. Nothing will ever change." That was loop one. Then later that day, after we had repaired, I watched my son. He was online and he was trying to connect with another child. Okay, and the other child started saying mean things to him. They couldn't understand why my son needed to repeat messages. He would copy and paste messages over again. Okay, this was part of his OCD, and also why he communicated the way that he did. And my heart just broke for him. Okay, he wanted friends so badly. He was so isolated, and he couldn't find anyone who understood him, who had patience for him, not even cousins. Those relationships had quietly fallen away too. And then I heard the voice start in my head. I need to do more. I need to find a way to help him connect. I'm not doing enough to get him out into the world. And that was loop number two. Okay, and then that evening, I found out we hadn't been invited to an extended family event. Okay, one that we used to always be included in. And I knew why, that we had said no so many times before because of my son's challenges. And so people had stopped asking, and I understood it. And yet it still hit me like a wave. Okay, that old feeling rose up, one I had felt so many times before. The shame and the grief of something is wrong with us. We don't belong, not even in our own family anymore. That was loop 3. Okay, and then by the end of the day, I was spent. Okay, not just from the parenting, but from carrying all 3 shame spirals on top of everything else. Okay, and this wasn't a bad day. This was a regular day in my life. This happened on repeat for many days, for many years. Okay, so if you resonate with my story, I want you to know that this is not just you, okay? These 3 loops show up in almost every parent I work with. So let's just talk about them for a moment. Okay, so loop number 1 is the post outburst loop, right? So your child has been in threat state for hours, you've held it together for hours, and then you snap. You yell, you slam something, you say something you regret. And immediately, what comes in? That voice. I'm damaging my child. I am the problem. What kind of parent does that to a child who can't help it? Okay, so that is so common. I see this in so many parents. And then loop number 2, the not enough loop. Okay, you watch your child suffer through a meltdown, through isolation, through another impossible day. And the weight of not being able to fix it becomes, I am failing them. If I were a better parent, I would figure this out. Okay, then loop number 3, the isolation loop. Okay, you can't go to the birthday party, or you leave the grocery store halfway through, or your family doesn't understand. And slowly that becomes, something is fundamentally wrong with us. We don't belong anywhere. Okay, and the challenge is that each one feels like truth. Each one feels like a verdict on who you are and who your child is. But none of them are. Okay, none of these are. And here's why. Okay, so there are 3 things happening when you experience these shame loops. Okay, so let's understand those, right? Because it's so important to gain awareness of what's happening in your nervous system, what causes you to go into these patterned shame loops. Okay, so the first thing to understand, okay, is that we are all wired for shame. So this is layer 1. We are all wired for shame. Okay, shame is not a personal flaw, it's ancient survival biology. Okay, so we are all social creatures, and for thousands of years, being cast out of the tribe meant death. Okay, so the brain that we all have, it evolved to use shame to keep us acceptable, to keep us in the group, belonging to the tribe. And when we violate what we believe a good parent or a good human should look like, then the nervous system fires shame automatically. Okay, so this is not weakness, this is wiring. It's normal, it's expected. Okay. Okay, so then let's understand the second thing, layer 2. Okay, so first there's the layer 1, as I told you, is all about how we're, neurobiologically wired. We all have this mechanism in us to feel shame when we feel like we're doing something wrong or bad that would cast us out from the tribe, right? And then layer 2, let's understand what happens in your nervous system when shame gets triggered. Okay, so when your child has been in a threat state for hours, right? You are feeling them, right? You're feeling their nervous system. You feel their activation in your body. That's part of the design. Okay. So you do absorb all of it. But as a parent, you're trying to hold it together, right? So what you do is you hold all of that activation in, and you hold and hold and hold. But that's called functional freeze. That's not regulation. But this is where so many parents really don't understand that, right? Because these are our patterns. We hold in and we act like we're okay to get through, but that holding in is not regulation. It's functional freeze, okay? And then what happens? Then you get to a point where you can't hold in anymore, and your alarm system snaps, and then your fight response takes over and you lose it. Okay, so then that explosion, it might feel like a release, right? But it isn't. So it isn't, because this reaction of fight didn't really resolve anything and get you back to safety. Instead, it came out sideways at your child, and your nervous system knows it wasn't like a clean discharge of, okay, I fought, I got through this, and now I'm back to being safe. It's not a clean discharge in that way. And then what happens is that activation is still in your body, okay, and it's uncompleted or incomplete, okay? And then what happens? Immediately this voice fires in your head. You're a monster, you damaged them, okay? And that's the inner critic. It's a protective part that learned long ago that shaming you back into line would stop things from getting worse, okay? And it's trying to help. It is protective, okay? But it's an old, painful strategy that triggers shame, right? So then that voice triggers shame, and shame is a physiological event, okay? It's not just a feeling. What happens is that your nervous system shifts from high activation fight into dorsal vagal shutdown or freeze, and that collapse state, okay? And you all know it when you're feeling ashamed, right? Your shoulders are forward, you feel heavy, you feel a little more numb, you feel more small, maybe your chest is tight, your throat is clamped. It's an awful, awful feeling when shame is there. But it's also, it's a vulnerable emotion, but it's also an inhibitory emotion, okay? Where the nervous system is slamming the brakes on, okay? So that you come out of that extreme fight flight. But also, to inhibitory means that it's stopping you from feeling other more vulnerable emotions. Okay, so it's protective too, in that it's trying to stop you from being overwhelmed by what's underneath. Okay, but here's the trap. Okay, shame doesn't discharge the stress. Okay, so when you go into shame, and then inner criticism, you may think it's helping you get better. But what happens is that your nervous system goes into more of a shutdown mode, which is not regulation. And then it builds a wall. Shame builds a wall around it, right? But underneath, there's still that rage and that terror under all that numbness of the shame, or the awful feelings of the shame. And underneath those, even deeper, are the vulnerable emotions that sit underneath the more activated emotions that got trapped in, which is the rage and terror. Then underneath that sit the more vulnerable emotions that are so hard to be with, which is the grief and the helplessness and the loneliness. Okay, and those emotions never got to move through. They stay frozen, and your nervous system then stays stuck. Okay, so that's layer 2. Layer 3 is that there's a shame wound that was already there from your childhood. Okay, that gets triggered in all of this too, which compounds the shame even more. Okay, so for most of us, like this shame pathway or this pattern that we go into, it was worn into us long before our child even arrived. Okay, so we learned early from a parent, a teacher, and any kind of institutional system, that when things go wrong, we are what's wrong. Okay, and we took on beliefs like, I'm bad, I'm wrong, I'm not enough, I'm to blame. And then that belief, it's important to understand, is that belief that gets triggered in this experience with our parents, it didn't start in this parenting experience. It actually started in childhood. Okay, and this parenting experience just triggers those old wounds, which is why the shame hits so hard and feels like truth, and why it stays stuck in a patterned loop. Okay, because you've learned this meaning making about yourself since you were very young, and now it's getting triggered in your parenting, and it feels like truth, right? But it's not truth, okay? It's a pattern that you learned, and it can be changed. So here's the shift, right? Shame is not the truth about who you are, okay? But when we're feeling it, it feels that way. But it's simply not the truth about who you are. It's a protection pattern that developed by taking on the voices and programming of those around you. Okay. And it's trying to make you do better and be better, although it's doing it in a way that's not working for you today and keeping you stuck. Okay. And it's protecting something even more vulnerable. And if those vulnerable emotions are not processed, then this keeps you stuck in shame. Okay. So are you following me here? Okay. So there's the layer of shame, there's a layer of inner criticism, there's a layer, then the layer that of shame, the inner criticism triggers, and then with the shame comes even more vulnerable emotions, as well as blocked or what's called thwarted fight flight energy that never got to complete. Okay. So when you go into this, response, right, of offloading on your child, losing it on your child, and then you have this post outburst shame, right? It's important to understand that what can often come out of that is there's this terror, this raw fear that you have hurt someone you love, right? There's also this grief and pain for how hard this parenting experience is and how out of control you feel. Okay. And underneath that, the not enough shame feeling, right? The times where you feel like I'm not doing enough for my child, there's grief there, but there's also helplessness there, right? Powerlessness, the unbearable weight of loving a child that you can't protect from their own nervous system, and how their nervous system gets received in the world that we live in. Okay. And then underneath the isolation shame, right? The shame that we feel that we don't belong, that something must be wrong with us. There's sadness and there's longing for belonging, right? For an easier life for your child too, and for an easier life for yourself. Okay. So there's a lot of very real, vulnerable emotions here. And when you touch into those vulnerable emotions, it's actually touching into something older, usually from your own childhood and the meaning making that you took on about how you were not enough. Okay, it all comes back to that belief, comes down to that belief. I I am not enough. I am not enough as I am, right? And then we learned to go quiet and small when things went wrong. We took on the blame because it felt safer than the alternative, which was um, to believe that our caregivers were the one in the wrong, right? As a child, you don't believe your caregivers are the one in the wrong. You believe that you take the blame. It's all, you make meaning about yourself and you say something must be wrong with me. Okay. So it's very vulnerable what gets triggered in this parenting experience with our kids. But the shame that you're feeling today didn't start with your child. It started long before. So it's important to understand that and have that awareness when you go into these shame patterns. Okay. Because when you understand that, then you can stop fighting the shame, right? You can get curious about what it's carrying. And this is where it becomes important to get comfortable with supporting the more vulnerable emotions that shame is inadvertently protecting you from feeling. Okay, so shame in itself is vulnerable, but it's also numbing you down, making you feel this awful feeling to try to get you to change. But then underneath that are those awful, or those very hard, vulnerable emotions like grief and sadness, helplessness and powerlessness that also need to be worked with and helped and supported as well. Okay, so doing this inner work, okay, being with the shame, not identifying with it or seeing it as truth, and working with the vulnerable emotions and beliefs underneath. Okay, this is incredibly powerful work. Okay, so when I started to see my inner critic as a protector and not as truth, something really shifted within me. Okay, when I got comfortable sitting with the shame instead of fighting it and feeling what was underneath it, which was the grief or the fear or the helplessness, okay, that really helped me. And when I started to see that so many of those feelings and beliefs were not even about today, okay, that they came, a lot of them came from childhood, Okay, from learning that I had to be a certain way to be safe, to be loved, to belong, to be successful. Okay, when I could understand all of that, that's when something really changed. Okay, I felt like I was enough, even on the days when I would lose it, even when my son struggled, even when we didn't fit in. Okay, so what was happening in my life with my son was no longer defining whether I was enough or not. Okay, so this is life changing work. If you work with the shame and this inner critic and recognize that you're enough as you are, it is life changing work, right? And and this work is not just for you. It's for your child too. It benefits them immensely. Okay? So when you're frozen in a shame loop, okay, your body goes collapsed, it goes more numb, it becomes disconnected, more distant. Okay? And your child's nervous system reads that as threat. So even when you're trying to look calm on the outside, okay, they can read it. Our children are exquisitely attuned to our nervous system cues, right? They see our eyes or the tension we're holding in our body. They see, the look on our face, the numbness on our face. They see our overall energy. Okay, so this is what I call the double threat cycle. Okay, they're already dysregulated, and now they sense you collapsing inside too, and their internal logic registers. Not only is this situation dangerous, but my parent is breaking. The person who is supposed to be my safe harbor is gone now. Okay. And that adds a whole second layer of unsafety on top of what they're already carrying. Okay. And I'm not saying any of this to shame you. Okay. Because it's not your fault. Your nervous system is going to do what it does, it's going to go there automatically. Okay. So, but the key is to understand and motivate you to know that staying stuck in these shame loops is not going to help you and it's not going to help your child. Okay, so when you begin to unthaw from shame, when you come back into your body, then and you start to regulate, their nervous system reads it and then they can co-regulate off you. Okay, so this is the reason why we don't want to stay stuck in shame and we want to help ourselves come out of it, because our regulation is their regulation, especially when they're young. Okay. And it's not a metaphor, it's actually biology. And so when you approach, repair with yourself and then with them from a grounded place, not from drowning in shame and not needing their forgiveness to feel okay about yourself, that you actually understand yourself, you forgive yourself, you're with yourself, you can soothe yourself and you regulate yourself, and you model something very powerful to them. You model that I made a mistake, I take responsibility, and I am still okay and I'm still here for you. Okay, and for a child who already carries so much shame about their own nervous system, watching you do that is one of the most healing things that they can witness, because then they learn it for themselves. And I can say, like, after years of, me having many meltdowns and moments like this, and then repairing with myself, coming out of that shame loop, repairing with myself, then repairing with my child, I can see that when my child does my son now, years later has learned this in himself. And it's beautiful to see. Okay, so I used to end days, right? Like the one I described, completely hollow, not just tired from parenting, but crushed under the weight of all three loops. Okay, but that changed when I stopped fighting the shame and got curious about what I was carrying. Okay, and that can change for you too. Okay, so what does this actually look like when a shame loop hits? And what are you going to do here, right? So I'm offering you two practices that I want to walk you through. Okay, so practice number one is working with the inner critic. And I recommend get to know your inner critic well, okay? Because it's always going to be there chirping, because it learned a long time ago and we took on the beliefs that we're not enough. And this inner critic is always going to be there chirping, okay? So when a shame loop hits, you'll often notice this inner critic voice before anything else. Well, it depends. Everybody's different. Some people will notice inner critic voice coming. Some people will just notice the feeling of the shame and totally shutting down. Okay. But that inner critic voice is there. So get to know it. Okay. Befriend it, become its friend. Okay. Because it will say things like, you're damaging them. You're not enough. Nothing will ever change. Right. And when you hear it, don't argue with it. Okay. Don't try to silence it because it'll just become louder and stronger. So instead, become the curious observer of it. Okay. Say to it, either out loud or internally, thank you for trying to protect me. Okay. You're allowed to be here too. So allow it to be here. Thank it for protecting you. And then get curious and ask it, where did you learn to say these things? Where did you learn to speak to me and to speak in this way? And then just wait and hear the response. And then you can also ask, what are you afraid will happen if you stop talking to us this way? Okay. And then you'll understand the fear underneath why this inner critic is so loud. Okay. What it's trying to protect. Okay. So it's important to remember this voice is not you. It's a part of you that took on the critical voices of caregivers, teachers, systems from a very long time ago. And it learned that shaming you into compliance or doing better would keep you safe and acceptable. Okay. It was trying to help then, but it's not helping now. And when you can see it as a protective part of you rather than the truth, then it begins to loosen its grip on you. Okay. Because then you can see that, oh, this is a pattern in my system that I learned, and I don't need to believe it as truth. Right. And as soon as you disidentify with it, then you step back into more of the truth of who you are and your system regulates. Okay, so practice number 2 is working with the shame and also all the vulnerable emotions that come with it. And what I find is the best practice for this is using Dr. Kristen Neff's 3 steps of self-compassion. Okay, so if you haven't taken it on a self-compassion practice, I highly recommend you do it. It is so incredibly regulating for the nervous system. You are reparenting yourself. You are helping your nervous system to learn a safe way of being with yourself, which is what we never learned growing up from our caregivers. Okay. And Kristen Neff is a researcher on self-compassion. She's written many books and she spent decades studying self-compassion. Okay. And her 3-step framework is one of the most powerful tools that I know for working with shame and also the vulnerable emotions underneath it. Okay. So step 1 is mindfulness, which is noticing what's here without judgment. Okay. So you feel where the shame lives in your body, whether it's the tight chest or the heavy stomach or the collapsed shoulders, or some people feel shame in their face. And you put your hand there. Okay. And you say, I feel you. It's okay that you're here. So you acknowledge it. You allow it to be here. You don't try to fix it or push it away. And you just let it be seen. Okay. If there's resistance to it, allow the resistance to be there too. Okay. And then go back to allowing the shame to be there and build tolerance for being with it. Okay. And then you can dig a little deeper and you can ask, what else are you holding? What else do you want me to know? What are you believing? Okay. So then you just wait and you hear from the sensation of this shame, and it begins to, unsurface what may be underneath: the terror, the grief, the helplessness, the old belief of I'm not enough. Okay. And the key is don't try to resolve it or fix it, right? Just be with it, witness it, let it unthaw slowly, and just let it be there. Okay. And then step 2. So that step 1 is mindfulness, right? So what I just said, notice where you feel it, be with it, allow it to be there. Don't try to fix it. Step 2 is common humanity, that feeling of you're not alone. I'm not alone. Okay. So you could place a hand on your heart and say, I am not alone in this. Every parent doing this work knows these loops. Okay, struggling, making mistakes, feeling like I'm not enough. This is all part of being human. And it doesn't mean that something is wrong with me. Okay. I can't tell you how many times I've done this. I feel the shame spiral coming in. I put the hand on my chest and one hand on my solar plexus because that's often where I feel the shame too. Or sometimes I'll put a hand on my face if I'm feeling it there. And I just speak to it kindly in this way. And I say, "You're not alone." And there's so many parents who feel this way too. And I imagine all the parents with high needs kids who are feeling shame just like me. Okay. And I feel that feeling of not being alone. Okay. I feel like this is very important for our population of parents. Hmm. And then step 3 is self kindness. Okay. So speak to yourself in the way you speak to a friend. So we kind of did that in step 2. But I want you to understand that this is not about toxic positivity. It's not about, "Oh, you're doing great," but it's something that feels honest, that you would say to someone that you love who was utterly exhausted and doing the hardest thing. Okay? Like something like, "This is generally one of the hardest things a parent can go through. Of course I'm struggling. Of course I've hit my limit. I am a human being, not a regulation machine." Okay, so let that land in your body, not just your mind, right? Speak to yourself in a way that it's okay. This makes sense. It's okay that I'm struggling. It makes sense. This is a hard experience to go through. Okay, and and you're not alone. Okay, so that's the full movement. So you see the inner critic for what it is. You feel the shame and what's underneath. Okay, you meet all of it with self compassion. And you don't do it just once, you do it again and again. Okay, and this is what helps to rewire your nervous system, right? It's it's not like a fix, but it helps create a new pattern that you can turn to so that you don't stay stuck in the old pattern that keeps your nervous system stuck and spiraling between shame and then losing it again, and then shame and then losing it again, and shame and losing it again. Okay, so we want to break free of that. We want to be with the shame. We want to help it. We want to be with the inner critic. We want to acknowledge it, but not listen to it as truth, so that we can move back into regulation, become unstuck and move back into regulation. Okay. So I want to go back to the 3 statements that we started with, right? The ones that I hear from parents all the time. I'm damaging them. I'm not doing enough. And something is wrong with us. Okay. And I want you to understand that these are not truth about you. Okay. They are the sound, the voices of a nervous system that learned a long time ago that shame would keep you safe. Okay. And you have been carrying these loops, these patterns, these shame patterns, some of them for decades. Okay. On top of the hardest parenting journey that exists. Okay. So that is not failure. That is a human being at their limit doing their best with what they were given. Okay. The shame makes sense. And, and you don't have to keep living inside of it. Okay. So start with one of those loops, right? One moment, one breath of self compassion. That's where it begins to change. Okay. So this is deep and meaningful work that you're doing, not just for yourself or your child, but for the world that exists all around you. Okay. Because each person who does this work creates a ripple effect in their child, in their family, and in the world around them. This is generational healing, my friends, and it starts here with you. So thank you for being here today. If this helped you gain awareness, if this resonated with you, please do share with other parents and please do leave comments. I love to read them. Thank you.